This is audio number 2, week 8. We're looking at slide 8. And so the principles that the Chinese side was applying in Tibet of the leadership of the CCP and so on are on this slide. And these were the principles that applied throughout the country. One thing to keep in mind about the sweep of recent history we've examined in Tibet is that it's gone from this earlier period under the PRC of an attempt to get along with local authority and use that authority to control the Tibetan, what became the Tibet Autonomous Region, through a series of disappointments and frustrations on the Chinese side, to the revolt of 1959 that led to the increased imposition of closer and more intense Chinese rule over the local population, punctuated by the difficulties of the Cultural Revolution, which messed everything up there, as well as, of course, in the rest of China. And coming out of the Cultural Revolution, the party had decided, as we've reviewed, to denounce the bad things that had happened, not to denounce the tragic hero of the revolution, Mao Zedong, who led it all, and to maintain what had been established by Mao Zedong, which was the rule of the socialist, the rule of the Communist Party and its leadership to take China down the road to a form of socialism, using Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought. So without question, the CCP is in charge. That's their real bottom line. And the democracy they speak of is not the kind of democracy that you and I are used to, which they would refer to as bourgeois democracy. It is the democracy of Leninism. It is the democracy of leadership under a revolutionary party led by an elite that is educated in the principles of socialism, using what they refer to as democratic centralism. Democratic centralism is the idea that we formulate, using our party's elite who understands socialist principles, we formulate our policies at the center, we issue them out and explain them to the population and to lower-ranking party members, of course, who facilitate this. We get feedback from them. We make adjustments as necessary to accomplish our goals, and then we tweak those policies, we adjust them, we send them back down, and we expect compliance. That's democratic centralism. The democratic part is the feedback. So these were the 4 cardinal principles that could not be violated, and they are enshrined in the newest constitution, the 1982 Constitution of the PRC, which added in, compared to the previous one, the 1975 Constitution, at the end of the Cultural Revolution, added in provisos about duty to the state and kept the same old stuff about rights to free speech and press and assembly, which had been in all the other ones and had never really meant anything. And some things were taken out. The right to strike, the right to move around inside the country. Previously, it had been possible, although there were permits required for living in most of the cities. It had been possible to move around to some extent in the country, although that was in practice pretty limited, but it was on the books. However, it was completely taken off the books, and I think there's a practical reason for all these things from the viewpoint of the people who were running the party. They knew they were going to change the economy. They knew that there was going to be some economic dislocation, although they might not have realized how much. And these three things that were taken out of the new Constitution certainly would have been inconvenient and difficult if they had been observed and had been used. Going on to slide 10. Deng Xiaoping thought, as they say in Chinese, "Yi wei, ta yi wei," "Ni yi wei," you thought that this was going to happen. You were under the wrong impression. Deng Xiaoping yi wei, he thought that there would be no more campaigns. But things started to get out of hand in the early 1980s, as you can see in this photograph. If you've ever seen the film Iron and Silk, that's iron as in I-R-O-N, Iron and Silk, which was made in 1985 by a guy named Mark Salzman, a martial arts expert and movie star sort of guy. He made a film about his time in China when he went there in the Yale in China program, and he was there when the spiritual pollution campaign hit. And the second half of the film focuses on all the difficulties he faced when the spiritual pollution campaign began. The story is salted, of course, with a bit of love interest that the state wanted to confound between the star, Mr. Salzman, and a young lady. And that indeed was one of the targets of the spiritual pollution campaign, was to make sure that we didn't have a whole bunch of Chinese marrying a whole bunch of foreigners, and it's not so much that necessarily that there was some sort of moral outrage here. The real problem that is seen in that kind of liaison in China is that Chinese people are trusted more than foreigners. There has always been the idea that there are some things you don't talk to foreigners about. Much more than there is, I think, in almost any other country, with a few exceptions like North Korea, Saudi Arabia, and other places I'd rather not live. But the idea is that there are problems that we can allow Chinese to find out about, but that we don't want foreigners to know about. And indeed, this has extended over time to the application of official secrecy to the most mundane facts and figures. How much timber is harvested every year in Jilin province, that sort of thing. It's kind of ridiculous. It was even more ridiculous than it is today back then in the 1980s. And so part of the problem of making sure that a minimum number of foreigners married a minimum number of Chinese was to make sure that secrets didn't leave the country, mundane though they were. Part of it was that there was pornography that was beginning to become a problem, and crime was going up, and the crime was thought to be connected to these other problems as well. As is often the case when crime starts going up, people start to blame outsiders. And Deng Xiaoping allowed this to go on for a little while, but then put an end to it after about, I think it was 6 months. But then came another problem of what was referred to as anti-bourgeois liberalization. The problem here, primarily, in my opinion, was that in 1986, as we'll see in a couple slides hence, all of a sudden there was blossoming democracy in Taiwan, which had for years been ruled by a dictatorial KMT regime. And this was to cause problems for the Communist Party, which culminated in the Tiananmen demonstrations of May and June 1989. But once people began to hear that democracy was being allowed and indeed was starting to work in Taiwan, this was a problem. It posed a viable alternative to the CCP regime, and indeed, with Taiwan having continued its progress toward representative government in a routine way over the decades, this is a continuing and indeed, I would say, deepening problem for the communist regime on the mainland. And their bottom line was that they wanted to minimize foreign influence and make sure Chinese stayed loyal to the CCP. They didn't want to go back to the bad old days when the heavens were dark and the earth was dark as well, if you remember the opening from that movie, Morning Sun. Going on to slide 11. What the regime did want to accomplish, however, was something that had originated in an idea back in 1963, and that Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong agreed to popularize in the early 1970s, although it didn't really get very far. And that was this idea of the four modernizations, which I couldn't, I could only remember three of them the last time we talked. But here they are in all their glory, so you can see all four of them. And I'm not going to read through this stuff because there's no point in wasting your time. You can read this just as well as listen to me talk about it. But the one thing I did want to point out is that agriculture was the earliest of these four modernizations, and indeed the most rapidly successful of them. And basically what happened is that once the productive forces of the countryside were released from being held back by communist orthodoxy, then all of a sudden people had incentive to produce more because they could take it to market and sell it and then buy things that they had never been able to buy before. That was a big deal, and that meant improved livelihood, and all you needed to get that improved livelihood was to work hard. And so people started doing that because now when one worked hard, it actually led to some sort of good result. Going on to slide 12. At the same time as the Communist Party was moving to modernize the country and its economy, they could see that there were some things that needed to be cut out because they were wasteful. And the People's Liberation Army, by the way, when in Chinese it's Jiefang Jun and for People's Liberation Army, and the Jun doesn't mean army, it means military. So they say the People's Liberation Army Navy, which Western observers call the Plan, P-L-A-N, the People's Liberation Army Air Force, People's Liberation Army Navy, Marines, and so on, is how they spell it all out in the Chinese language. But so many people had hung on for so long in the PLA because it was one of the most prestigious organizations in society, because it paid well, because it was secure. There were a lot of people, like these old geezers you see here in this photograph, who had been in the Army for a long time. They were not in fighting shape. That's a little bit unfair because this picture was taken after they've all been retired for a while, but you get the picture. And many of them were illiterate, just like the leftist Tibetans we talked about a moment ago. I had a experience with that one time myself when I was traveling in China in 86 I mean, and I had to ask directions in a police station in a remote town, and the people I spoke with in the police station told me that they were former soldiers. We had a nice little chat, and then it came time to consult the equivalent of a local phone book, and it dawned on me as we were sort of wrestling with that they couldn't read. And so I had to read it, in spite of my horrid Chinese at the time. But anyway, Deng Xiaoping realized, especially after the defeat, the de facto defeat, at the hands of the Vietnamese several years earlier in 1979, when he thought he was going to be Ta Yue, he thought he was going to be teaching the Vietnamese a lesson. He realized that the PLA needed to be reorganized, and the first thing to do was to cut out the dead wood. So all these people were let go, and a special system was set up. These service centers, like this one you see in the picture, which is a rather expanded facility, were set up to teach people skills, help them find housing, help them find a job. And on the Politburo itself, this is not the Politburo Standing Committee now, but it's the Politburo. I made a mistake. I'm going to have to correct this. But over half the people were military in 1977, only 10% in 1992, and I think it's actually about 5% today of the total Politburo, not the Politburo Standing Committee. There's now on the Politburo Standing Committee, there's nobody who's in the military. Going on to slide 13. So during this period, there was another big change, and that is that, as we discussed several weeks ago, even during the high tide of chaos during the Cultural Revolution, the nuclear and missile programs were not at all affected. They were allowed to not only survive, but thrive. And the same thing was true during this period. The nuclear program and the missile program remained national priorities, and nothing messed with those priorities. And it was in 1984 when the rocket forces first put online and ready to go the first ICBMs, standing for Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles. Up until this time, they had the CSS-3, which could hit places like central Russia and Guam. But in 1984, they deployed in significant numbers the CSS-4 ICBM that could hit the west coast of the United States. And in subsequent generations, of course, just like the Soviets and the Americans did, they developed MIRVs, the Multiple Independent Reentry Vehicles. So that gave Washington something to think about, didn't it? Going on to slide 14. That brings us to technology transfer, my favorite topic. Now these charts you see here are fairly recent, and indeed in a number of these slides I'm kind of bleeding over into the modern day. I'm going beyond 1999, but it's all in a good cause. It's all to make things more understandable. So in the Carter administrations, but especially in the Reagan and Bush administrations, technology transfer from the U.S. to China was a big deal. Only during the first few months of the Bush administration. He was inaugurated in January 1989, visited China in February 1989, his first foreign visit, and then June 1989 came and everything, the roof fell in after the Tiananmen Square massacre on technology transfer from the U.S. to China. But before that time, the successful SEZ experiments, the Special Economic Zone experiments, had brought in quite a bit of technology transfer from the West. And indeed, that was a primary purpose, one of the primary purposes of those zones, besides making money and generating jobs. Quite often, tech transfer was was required as part of a business deal to set up a factory, or even just to do business in the special economic zones, on a condition for the foreign company to meet. And it all required, of course, PRC government permissions and licensing. There were also clandestine technology acquisition efforts on the part of the Chinese, not only in these zones, as you might imagine, but the military and others set up front companies that would make purchases of different commodities that might not be approved for transfer to China by their host countries. They set up these businesses in the United States and in many other places. By the late 1980s, there were probably thousands of companies in the U.S. that had names like Eagle Technology or something like that. They would buy things like military-rated semiconductors that could stand extreme cold and heat, and they would box them up and label them as bananas and send them off to China. I'm not kidding. This is what they actually did. They were controlled by PRC nationals, and it wasn't like this sort of KGB effort to steal computers, big computers or anything. It was a bit more of a sort of massive effort that was less centrally controlled than the Russians had been doing in the 1970s. But anyway, the views of technology transfer by the foreign companies didn't necessarily reflect whether they'd been asked to transfer technology. Most companies were not actually asked to do so, but about a third. This sort of figure in these charts. One reason why I put them in is because this has been pretty consistent over time. This figure of about a third of the companies actually being asked to transfer technology was true in the 1980s and remains true today. Of course, any Chinese national working for a foreign company in China, if there was a knock on the door one day and he was asked or she was asked to work with a state entity to help the motherland and pick up a few extra secrets while you're on the job there, there's really no choice. I've spoken with a number of people about this sort of problem, and Chinese people, and even back then, although it was a different situation, the general idea was the same for everybody. People just generally kept their heads low, hoped they wouldn't be asked to do that kind of thing. If they were, though, they knew that they had to do it, and they'd follow through and just do their duty. Sort of like if you were a student intern at a Chinese company in Portland, and you got a call to go to the dean's office one day, and there was an FBI agent waiting to see you and asked you for your cooperation, you'd probably sit up in your chair and say, "Okay, I'll do it," because you wouldn't want the FBI to go investigating you. We'll stop here and go on to slide 15.